Between 1939 and 1945, more than 1 million Africans are reported to have been recruited to fight by European colonial powers. The Second World War was fought between the Axis powers and the Allies. The core Axis powers were Germany, Italy and Japan, who were supported by their colonies, many in Africa. The chief Allied powers included Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the United States, also supported by colonies. Historians report that African soldiers were transported to fight across Europe, Asia and North Africa. They also carried supplies and ammunition, constructed camps and dug trenches. The King's African Rifles, a British colonial infantry unit, recruited men from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda and Malawi, the British colonies. They fought in Ethiopia against the Italians, in Madagascar and in Myanmar against the Japanese. Meanwhile, France mobilized troops from countries like Senegal, Chad, Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco. They fought in various campaigns including the North African landings. Belgium recruited soldiers from the Belgian Congo, while a contingent of South African troops also fought alongside British forces. Troops from Sudan, Sierra Leone and the Gambia also contributed to the British war effort. Many were wounded or killed. While there aren't exact records of the deaths, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History estimates that about 4.5 million Africans were mobilized during the First and Second World Wars. Of these, it estimates that about 2 million likely died. French President Emmanuel Macron previously expressed gratitude for the contribution of African soldiers in defeating German forces occupying France. Despite their courage, many African soldiers returned to their homelands unrecognized, unpaid, overlooked and forgotten. Today, historians and activists are working to bring these soldiers back into the spotlight. French President Emmanuel Macron previously expressed gratitude for the contribution of African soldiers in defeating German forces occupying France, while the UK has supported a section of African veterans through welfare grants. But 80 years after the end of the Second World War, many African soldiers lie dead and forgotten. Wilkis Anyabo, CGTN.
Well, for more on this, we spoke earlier to Dr. Hassan Kanenje, director at the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies. He gave us his thoughts on befitting recognition and compensation of African soldiers and the major gains for Africa in the aftermath of World War II and beyond.
The contribution of African veterans, especially in the Second World War, to European, colonizers was actually enormous. Hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million of them actually served alongside and on the front line of this campaign that contributed to the defeat of Germany and Japan, not just in the African theater, but also in the Asia-Pacific region, especially in Burma, for instance. Now, this, while it may have been a success story when it comes to the entire campaign against the Germans and the Japanese, it's a sorry state when it came to actually the African affairs itself. Because not only were they not recognized, many of them were excluded, were discriminated against, and they didn't actually have much to write home about. And so despite the recent efforts, especially by some European powers such as France, to recognize their contribution, there has been sufficient compensation or follow-up. Now, many of them, the veterans, are dead. However, their families and their memories are still alive. And I think that is why I think it is important that this conversation continues in a way that recognizes substantively African contribution to liberating the world from fascism in 1945. They need to move beyond tokenism. Giving a few grants for monthly survival is actually not sufficient, because the veterans, especially in the Western capitals, they enjoyed a lot of privileges many years following their involvement in that campaign. And the same, while may not be done on that scale, more substantive engagement with regard to those who are surviving as well as their families is going to be something that is actually useful, not just in the form of grants, but also in the construction and building some of the monuments in ways in which can be able to advance the sacrifices that were undertaken. But also economically, trying to compensate some of these communities where this people came from, let's say through certain direct investments in education as well as health, in a way that is more substantive. Because the kind of tokenism while it may form as a way of compensation, is actually just, I think, a way to also whitewash history and diminish the agency of Africans in the Second World War. Most certainly, the experience of African soldiers, especially abroad, they came across countries that were actually free. They were fighting for freedom for countries which they didn't have in their own, and therefore, upon return, the veterans formed the backlog of actually the foundation of liberation movements, especially the armed liberation movements, and particularly such as Kenya, for instance, the Mau Mau movements. But also it put in place, or rather created a precedence where not only were they demanding for independence, but the emerging Cold War dynamic made it easier for colonial masters to actually let go of African countries, but also pushed countries to demand not just for the removal of colonialism, but complete independence in which they're going to determine their own future, especially in the wake of the United Nations Charter that, of course, required not just self-determination, but actually complete independence of countries. And yes, so there's some good things that came as a result of that. However, the damage is something that needs to be recognized, and the sacrifices of Africans need to be appreciated in a way that goes beyond rhetoric to some practical aspects and engagements, especially by those who are most responsible.